Back then, people were more worried about being trampled by a runaway stagecoach than whether their skincare routine had SPFA. Life was simpler, yes, but also unsettlingly creepy by today's standards. In the Wild West, what we now call horrifying, was another Tuesday. Whether drinking water from a barrel full of tadpoles or trusting a stranger with a snake oil remedy for anything, folks had an unnerving knack for rolling with the bizarre. So, saddle up, partner, because we're about to dive into the creepiest things that were just part of everyday life back then. Postmortem photography, or memorial photography, was the art. And yes, it was considered an art of capturing images of the recently deceased. It may sound chilling, but these photos were treasured keepsakes, especially in the Wild West, where mortality rates were sky-high, thanks to disease, accidents, and let's not forget the occasional bar fight over who had the best mustache. During this era, photography was expensive, and most families couldn't afford to take pictures while everyone was alive. So, when a loved one passed away, families would scrape together their pennies for one last photo, an eerie but heartfelt way to preserve their memory. Here's where things get even creepy. Photographers had to stage the deceased as if they were alive. This was no small feat. Bodies were dressed in fine clothes, often their best attire. They would then pose sitting in chairs, lying peacefully in bed, or even standing upright with the help of special contraption. To make the photos appear more lifelike, the deceased's eyes might be painted open on the photograph, or their faces touched up with makeup. If you've ever looked at a vintage photo and thought, why does that person look off? There's a good chance you were staring at a post-mortem photo, but it wasn't just about posing the deceased. Families often joined in for these portraits, creating what can only be described as the ultimate awkward family photo. Of course, smiling was discouraged, because let's face it, grinning next to a dead relative wasn't exactly in good taste. You might be wondering why on earth would anyone want a picture of their dead relative propped up like a mannequin? Life in the Wild West was unpredictable, and death came quickly and often. Families didn't have Instagram feeds full of selfies or cloud storage to keep a gazillion photos. That one post-mortem picture might be the only visual reminder they'd ever have of their loved one. This practice also reflected the Victorian obsession with death and mourning. Back then, death wasn't the taboo topic it is today. Mourning rituals were elaborate, and keeping mementos of the dead, such as locks of hair or jewelry made from their remains, was seen as deeply sentimental rather than ghoulish. Medicine shows were the original traveling circus of quackery, combining entertainment with a heavy dose of snake oil salesmanship. The so-called doctors were often charlatans with little to no medical training, peddling concoctions made from, well, anything. Many of these elixirs included ingredients like alcohol, sometimes up to 50%, opium, cocaine, and even mercury. Yes, mercury is the same stuff we now know as highly toxic. Back then, it was marketed as a cure for everything from toothaches to syphilis. And let's not forget the famous snake oil, which became a catch-all term for fraudulent cure. The original snake oil came from Chinese immigrants, who used actual snake fat to remedy inflammation. But Wild West quacks replaced the real thing with cheaper ingredients like turpentine or plain old mineral oil. They were selling dreams in a bottle. Dreams that often came with a side of addiction or slow poisoning. What made these medicine shows so popular wasn't just the dubious potions, but the over-the-top entertainment that came with them. These events were part carnival and part sales pitch. The doctor was usually accompanied by musicians, comedians, dancers, and sometimes exotic animals. Picture a brass band playing jaunty tunes, while a fire eater dazzles the crowd, all to distract you from the fact that you're about to buy a bottle of cough syrup laced with opium. The showman would give glowing testimonials about the miraculous powers of their product, often with patients planted in the audience to dramatically rise from wheelchairs or declare their eyesight restored. It was like a live infomercial, except with more snake oil and fewer disclaimers. The scariest part? People believed these elixirs worked, at least at first. A dose of laudanum, an opium-based tincture, would certainly make your headache go away. But it might also leave you addicted or, in some cases, dead. Mercury, a common ingredient, could lead to tremors, memory loss, and organ failure. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the government began to crack down on these fraudulent practices. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was a major turning point, requiring labels to list ingredients and banning false claims. But until then, the Wild West was essentially the Wild East for quack doctors, who made their fortunes at the expense of desperate and trusting people. The idea of trusting someone in a fancy coat and a tall hat, only to realize they've just sold you poison, is deeply unsettling. These medicine shows preyed on people's fears and hopes, exploiting their lack of medical knowledge. The thought of entire families unknowingly poisoning themselves in the name of health is enough to send a shiver down anyone's spine. Life was tough, grim, and often short in the Wild West, so when the town announced an execution, it was a rare chance to break the monotony. People didn't just show up, they prepared. Families packed picnic baskets, vendors sold snacks, and makeshift bleachers were erected for better views. It wasn't uncommon for someone to lean over a neighbor and say, "Pass the pie, please." As the condemned shuffled up to the gallows, the mood surprisingly festive. For many, this was the equivalent of modern reality TV. Shocking, raw, and oddly captivating. For the children, it was a thrilling day off from chores. They didn't see it as horrifying, they saw it as exciting. After all, the Old West wasn't big on shielding kids from harsh realities. Back then, justice in the Wild West was swift and often public. If someone committed a crime, say cattle rustling, robbery, or even murder, their fate could be sealed within days. Judges, juries, and sheriffs worked at a pace that would make modern courts look sluggish. Once the verdict was in, words spread like wildfire. There's going to be a hanging. Entire towns would show up for the occasion. Families dressed in their Sunday best, children were given front-row seats, and vendors sold everything from roasted peanuts to lemonade. It wasn't uncommon for people to treat it like a social gathering. "See you at the gallows" might have been a legitimate farewell for friends parting ways on the street. The condemned, meanwhile, often had to face the crowd literally. Some prisoners made speeches begging forgiveness, while others cursed their accusers until the noose silenced them. A few even cracked jokes, their gallows humor, pun intended, earning nervous laughs from the audience. Parents, meanwhile, seemed completely unfazed by their kids witnessing such a gruesome spectacle. Many adults saw these events as teachable moments. "That's what happens when you steal a horse, Johnny," a father might say, pointing at the lifeless body swinging in the breeze. In the 19th century, America was undergoing massive social and scientific changes. Medical schools were booming, but there was one major issue. They didn't have enough cadavers for dissection. Now, if you think that seems gruesome, you're not alone. Back then, though, there was little in the way of ethics regarding anatomy lessons. Doctors needed bodies to study the human form and its functions, but acquiring them legally was much more difficult than you might imagine. The laws regarding body snatching, yes, it had its term, were a little behind the times. In most places, the only people whose bodies could be legally dissected were criminals who had been executed. So, unless you had a steady stream of fresh offenders, and let's face it, that's a rather limited supply, anatomy schools were in trouble. But then came a rather enterprising solution. Body snatchers, also known as resurrectionists. These individuals took it upon themselves to exhume freshly buried bodies and sell them to medical schools. It wasn't just limited to the Wild West, it was a widespread problem across the United States. The dead had no peace, and their bodies were treated as commodities for scientific experimentation. So, how did these body snatchers work? Well, it wasn't exactly the kind of thing you'd see in a horror movie, unless that movie was set in an anatomy classroom. Typically, body snatchers would wait until dark, sneak into graveyards, and carefully dig up the recently deceased. They often targeted people who had been buried without a lot of ceremony or attention, as they knew there would be less of a fuss if the body went missing. They would steal the bodies, sometimes still in their burial clothes, and sell them to the highest bidder. The bodies didn't come cheap. Resurrectionists could make a pretty penny by delivering them to medical schools, which were often desperate for fresh cadavers for dissection. Some schools were happy to disregard how they acquired the bodies, as long as the cadaver was ready to be dissected. But it wasn't just about medical schools. Some shady private buyers would purchase bodies for their own bizarre and creepy purposes. Whether it was for private collections, selling to museums, or being resold to other anatomy schools, the dead were treated like property rather than people. The year was 1876, and the small town of Deadwood in South Dakota was buzzing with life. The Black Hills were rich with gold, and Deadwood rapidly became a lawless town filled with miners, gamblers, and a motley crew of wild characters. Among them was Wild Bill Hickok, a former lawman turned gambler who had earned a reputation as a sharpshooter and fearless adventurer. On August 2nd, 1876, Hickok sat down for a game of poker at the saloon known as the Number 10. Unbeknownst to him, it would be his last. While playing, Hickok was shot in the back of the head by Jack McCall, a disgruntled gambler who had lost a poker hand to Hickok earlier. McCall, angry over losing, sneaked up behind Hickok and shot him in the back of the head. But before Hickok fell dead, he was holding a pair of aces and eights, 2 aces, and 2 eights to be exact, which made up a hand that would go down in history as the dead man's hand. Here's the creepy part. Hickok's hand was not just a coincidence. The idea of the dead man's hand became steeped in superstition almost immediately after Hickok's death. It's said that the hand of aces and eights has since been associated with death, bad luck, and untimely demise. Some believe that the hand was cursed because it marked Hickok's violent death. Others argue that it represents a reminder that death can strike unexpectedly, even amid something as innocent as a card game. Whatever the reason, the dead man's hand quickly became a symbol of bad luck, and not just for gamblers. Now that we know the dead man's hand, let's talk about why it became such a feared and infamous symbol. In the world of gambling, superstitions are rampant. The belief in lucky and unlucky cards runs deep, and every gambler has a handful of unlucky hands that they avoid at all costs. The dead man's hand wasn't just a lousy hand. It was a constant reminder of the fragility of life in the Wild West, where a man could go from holding cards to holding his last breath in the blink of an eye. Aces and eights, as it turns out, were seen as a bad omen. Aces are often considered wild cards, but when paired with eights, the combination has a certain ominous feel. Eights are symmetrical, representing balance and stability. But in the case of the dead man's hand, they were seen as a symbol of death's certainty, the inevitable end that awaits us all. In the lawless, often chaotic world of the Old West, where authorities were scarce and justice was often in short supply, a gunfight could break out at any moment. Tensions were high, and life was tough. The absence of a reliable legal system meant that personal grievances were settled by whoever could pull the trigger the fastest. One moment, a heated argument would escalate into a full-fledged shootout. The next, the echo of gunfire would reverberate down the dusty street, signaling a bloody confrontation between men trying to defend their honor, or, more often, their pride. Many of these gunfights were seen as a necessary evil in a society that valued personal freedom above all else. In towns where law enforcement officers were scarce or non-existent, it was up to individuals to protect their interests, even if that meant drawing first and asking questions later. It wasn't always the bravado-filled, heroic gunfighter we see on the silver screen. Sometimes it was just plain foolishness or misunderstanding that led to bloodshed. One of the most famous gunfights of all time, the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, epitomizes the lawless culture of the Wild West. On October 26, 1881, in what is often considered the most famous shootout in American history, the Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, and their friend Doc Holliday, faced off against the Clanton-McClory gang. The fight lasted only about 30 seconds, but it would become legendary. The reasons behind the fight are often debated, but at its heart was a simmering rivalry between the lawmen, the Earps and Holliday, and the lawless gangsters, the Clantons and McClorys. Disputes over cattle rustling, stagecoach robbery, and control of Tombstone's burgeoning economy were at the core of the tension. But the trigger was a minor confrontation about the McClorys' refusal to disarm, which was against the law in the town. The gunfight was brief, with gunfire ringing out from both sides. In the end, 3 of the Clanton-McClory men were killed, and the Earps and Doc Holliday emerged victorious. But the aftermath was far from glamorous. The shootout did little to settle the long-standing tension in Tombstone, and the Earps were soon embroiled in a series of bitter legal battles. Despite the sensational nature of the gunfight, it was more of a violent, necessary response to a broader conflict, and it didn't bring peace to the region. It only escalated the violence. While shootouts like the OK Corral were highly publicized, smaller, less iconic gunfights happened with alarming frequency in towns across the West. Many were not the epic, high-stakes duels between infamous outlaws and legendary law enforcement officers. They often resulted from petty quarrels, miscommunications, and pure egos. For example, drinking was a way of life in many frontier towns, and saloons were the epicenters of conflict. A cowboy might accidentally spill another man's drink, or a gambler might win a poker hand with a questionable move. The next thing you know, someone would draw a gun and a shootout would ensue. For settlers in the Wild West, life was rough. There were no movie theaters, smartphones, or TikTok to keep people entertained. Instead, they turned to live action shows, many of which pitted animals against one another in fights that were as gruesome as they were wildly popular. Take dogfighting, for example. This wasn't about Lassie helping Timmy out of a well. It was about fierce, specially bred dogs tearing into each other while spectators cheered, placed bets, and swigged whiskey. The goal? To see which dog could last the longest without collapsing. In many cases, these fights ended with one dog dead or maimed, leaving the victor bloodied but alive. For the owners, it was a chance to make money. For the crowd, it was cheap entertainment. For the dogs, a one-way ticket to misery. But dogfights were only the appetizer. Things got much wilder, literally. If you think dogfighting is bad, wait until you hear about bear baiting. Picture this: a massive, grizzly bear captured from the wilderness, chained to a post in the center of a ring. The bear would then be attacked by a pack of dogs whose job was to bring it down. It was a thrilling spectacle for the audience, watching an apex predator fight for its life against a gang of snarling canines. For the bear, though, it was a nightmare. Chained and unable to escape, it had to fend off relentless attacks. Most of the time, the bear would win, but not without suffering severe injuries, including torn flesh and broken bones. The dogs, meanwhile, were often ripped to shreds. Grizzly bears weren't the only victims. Bulls, too, found themselves unwilling participants in this macabre form of entertainment. And let's not forget the human cost. Injuries among spectators and handlers were frequent. Bulls that broke free from their restraints often charged into crowds, causing chaos and sometimes killing onlookers. Bear handlers occasionally became unintended victims, mauled by the animals they sought to exploit. Let's start with one of the quirkiest cowboy traditions, carrying a rabbit's foot. Now, why a rabbit's foot? What about the rest of the rabbit? According to folklore, the foot, particularly the left hind, was considered a powerful good luck charm. Cowboys believed it would ward off bad luck, protect them from danger, and even help them win a few hands of poker. The logic: if a rabbit could outrun predators and survive with its wits, a little piece of that magic could rub off on its human carrier. Of course, one has to wonder what the rabbit thought of this arrangement. Not very lucky for the rabbit. One of the Wild West's most peculiar superstitions involved pocket knives. According to the cowboy code, you should never close a knife someone else open. Doing so was said to cut the friendship or bring bad luck. This belief might seem trivial today, but keeping your bond strong was critical in a world where friends were often the only thing standing between you and a band of outlaws. The belief in witches wasn't confined to New England. The Wild West had its share of witchy paranoia. Cowboys believed that witches could hex their cattle, curse their journeys, or even steal their souls. Stories of mysterious women wandering alone in the desert, or appearing at night around campfires, only fueled these fears. To ward off witches, some cowboys turned to fire. Burning sage or cedar was thought to cleanse the air of dark spirits. Others relied on silver bullets not just for werewolves, but also to protect themselves from witches. The Wild West wasn't just wild. It was a mix of superstition, survival, and sheer audacity. What seemed creepy to us now was just a normal event to them. What are your thoughts about this? Thanks for watching. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates.